Bergen-Belsen was emblematic of Nazi horrors until they found out later on about Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek. The big difference between Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen would be that in Auschwitz you suffered only 40 minutes. You were gone. In Bergen-Belsen, you suffered until you died.
Judah Samet remembers what it was like to be in Bergen-Belsen. At the age of 6, he and his family were sent to the infamous concentration camp located in northwestern Germany. The camp is perhaps best known because of one of its most famous prisoners, Anne Frank. But she was only one of the nearly 50,000 innocent people to die there. Judah's story begins with his birth in Hungary in 1938.
I had 2 brothers, Moshe and Yaakov, or Polly, and Tibi, and 1 sister, Henya, or Henche. I grew up in a very Orthodox home. We were well-to-do people. We had a knitting factory where we also had a retail section in there where we made clothes for the upper crust in our city. Debrecen was the 3rd largest city in Hungary.
When Judah was 2, in 1940, the Germans and Hungarians entered into an alliance. Hungary joined the Axis and participated in the invasions of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Life for the 825,000 Hungarian Jews was tenuous. There was discriminatory legislation against the Jews and widespread anti-Semitism, but they were relatively secure. The Hungarian Prime Minister, Miklos Kale, even refused to deport the Hungarian Jews, despite significant pressure from the domestic radical right. But everything changed when the German and Hungary Pact ended in March 1944.
In that 1st or 2nd week of April, they took us out of our homes. The Gendarmerie, led by the Gestapo, came to our street and ordered us to vacate, gave us 15 minutes, ordered us to take with us only the very basic things, 1 underwear change, our important papers, and jewelry, money, and so forth. They marched us to the railway. It took most of the day, a little cold and drizzly. It was early spring, late winter. We parked at the railroad waiting for transportation. There were a few thousands of us there. My mother volunteered to be the cook. They supplied us with 2 or 3 or 4 bed tops, and she was cooking soup. That's the only thing that they gave us, soup and some bread.
Judah and his family, along with thousands of other Jews, waited. The Nazis arranged 2 transports. Those on the first were crammed into trains that went directly to Auschwitz. But the Samets remained behind at the station.
A few weeks later, the 2nd transport arrived, and we were all on the platform waiting to be loaded onto the cattle cars. 30, 40, 50 to each car. My mother noticed that they were carrying 2 buckets into each car. 1 bucket was filled with water, and the other bucket was for toilet purposes.
Judah's mother, Rachel, risked her life to beg the Nazi commandant for larger drums of water. It wasn't the first or the last time that Rachel would use her wits to plead for her family.
She was a tower of strength. She never wavered. She was never scared. Her mind was dedicated 24 hours a day to saving her family. And she was not afraid of anybody, whether it was the German commandant or anything like that.
Because the family had waited for the 2nd transport, luck was with them. Partisans had bombed the railways in Czechoslovakia, so the captive Jews were farmed out as slave laborers instead of going directly to Auschwitz and almost certain death.
We ended up in a lumber yard. The lumber yard was owned by a major Nazi in Austria. He had some French prisoners of war, some Italian prisoners of war, but we were treated differently than they were. We were limited to food, and there again, my mother did something that was a risk to her life.
Judah's mother would sneak out of the labor camp after work and visit the village. She offered to knit clothing, doilies, anything in exchange for cheese, milk, and eggs from the local villagers. That food helped keep her family alive. But one day, someone turned her in, and she was arrested.
That my mother was not shot on the spot was a miracle. She was put in jail. She shared the room with a German girl. Now, what was the crime of the German girl is that she would not follow Hitler's orders to pleasure German soldiers coming home for furlough from the Russian front. She ended up hung.
The Samet family never expected to see Rachel again.
And my mother somehow managed to come back to the lumberyard. We kind of gave up on her. We thought she was surely dead. So it just shows again my mother's initiative and mental strength. She was a very, very unusual woman. Then after a while there was transportation became available, and they took us to Bergen, Belsen.
Bergen-Belsen was originally built as a prisoner of war camp, but in 1943 the SS began using it as a concentration camp. The Samets arrived there in June 1944 and stayed until just 2 weeks before the camp's liberation by the British on April 15, 1945. Judah has faded, yet often vivid memories of his time there.
I cannot remember exactly what we did every single day. I know that the food that we received was a loaf of bread for the family, the size of a small cantaloupe, and it was very hard, it was black, it was supposed to last a week. So we were hungry all the time.
Hunger was always there. So was death.
Every morning when we got up for the roll call, there was a stack of 3 stories high of corpses. By the end of the day, they were gone. Next morning, the same. Every day, 1,000 to 1,500.
One incident still disturbs Judah.
There was roll call, and for some reason, I stayed in bed. I didn't get up. And there was another old man about 7 bunks down from me. And this fellow in a blue uniform must have been one of the Croatian guards. The Germans employed Croatians and Ukrainians who were very, very anti-Semitic. They were worse than the Nazis. And I saw, he said to the old man, "Get up." He didn't get up, so he hit him with a metal stick 3-4 times, and he killed him, and he didn't see me. Now, did it happen, or was it a nightmare?
Starvation and sickness surrounded the prisoners. Judah became quite ill because of the lice infestation. One of his bites became infected.
As a kid, I didn't pay attention to it until I was in terrible pain, and I said my head hurts, and my mother touched me, and she said I was burning with fever. So lucky for us, there was a doctor in our barrack.
With no painkillers, the doctor operated on Judah's head. He still carries the scar, a constant reminder of his time in Bergen-Belsen.
So I have like a valley right here on my back. And thank God it doesn't bother me. Sometimes a little bit when the weather changes. So that was definitely a miracle in my case.
In early spring, the Germans asked for volunteers from Bergen-Belsen to go work in a labor camp. Rachel Samet jumped at the chance for her family to escape the horrible conditions. They traveled for days, squeezed yet again into a cattle car, with the car stopping every few days to empty the dead. One day, it stopped altogether.
And we were in the woods, deep forest on both sides. And there was nobody there, and the doors were open. The Germans were gone. I thought, this is it, they're going to finish us here. And we heard a rumbling of something, of a military vehicle, which turned out to be a tank. And it came out of the woods, and we thought, this is it. It was kind of funny that the turret was not aimed at us, it was aimed to the side. And when the turret opened, it was an American. So we were saved. Our liberation probably came a few days after Bergen Belsen's liberation.
It took Judah another 60 years before he began to publicly tell people about his experiences as a child in the infamous Bergen-Belsen camp.
Because I realized that I'm 73, and I'm one of the youngest to survive. But I still have memories of that. And I have perspective, I have context. And knowing what's going on around the world, in 10, 15 years, there's not going to be alive to tell the story. So how will they know? I'm a living witness.